Hi, welcome to the Gemara on Yud Chet Amud Bet. This is sheet number 18, and we're starting 4 lines up from where the wide lines are in the Gemara, with the words mitnamnem yatsa. It's the first words on the line, and this is a quote from the Mishnah. We're now discussing this idea of someone being sort of asleep while reading Megillah. Hechidami mitnamnem. What is the situation with mitnamnem? What does it mean that he's kind of asleep? Amar Rav Ashi, nim velo nim, tir velo tir. This person is asleep but not asleep, awake but not really awake. So Rashi says tir means awake. So the person is neither fully awake nor fully asleep. Tekaru leva'ani, if you call out to this person, they will answer you. Velo yada lahadure svara, but they don't know how to return a logical response. Rashi says, lahadure svara, davar haba mibinat halev, something that comes from your intellect. So that you're not going to get an intellectual response from this person. But if you remind the person of something, then they remember. So kind of this half asleep, half awake state. Haya kotva dorsha u'meyiha im kiven libo yatsa v'chulei. Continuing in the Mishnah, if a person is writing the Megillah or explaining the Megillah, right, darshaning it out, or pronouncing or correcting the Megillah, Megillah is going over the words to correct them. If you have kavanah, then you fulfilled your obligation. Hechidami, what is the situation? What's the case that we're talking about in this part of the Mishnah? Idaka mesader psuka psuka v'katavla, if you are organizing one verse at a time, basically mentally arranging each verse one at a time. And Rashi explains, Masader psuka al peh, you're doing this by heart, v'katavle, and then you write it down. So you think to yourself, this is the pasuk, and then you write it down. V'katana yatsa al yedei kriyat oto sidur, and the Mishnah teaches that you are yotze by reading that. So if what you're doing is, you're saying each pasuk to yourself and then writing it down, ki kiven libo mai have, even though you had kavanah mai have, like what do you think happened here? What does it matter? Al pehu, this is still by heart. Again, the situation is you're arranging each pasuk in your mind and then you write it down, so the actual recitation is by heart because you didn't have the verses in front of you when you recited them. Ella dekata psuka psuka v'karile. No, it must be that you wrote, as Rashi said, that you wrote down each pasuk and then you read it. That has to be the case that's described in the Mishnah here. Now we have a challenge to this. Umi yatsa, who says, is it really the case that this person fulfilled their obligation? V'ha amar Rabbi Chelbo amar Rav Chama bar Goria amar Rav. Don't we have a statement in the name of Rav, right? Mi yatsa is also a question because mi is a question, and veha amar introduces a challenge phrase. Isn't it the case that it was said in the name of Rav? Halacha kedivrei haomer kula. The halacha is like the one who says all of it. So Rashi here explains to you, tzarich likrot, you have to read the whole Megillah. Uplige batanai b'matnitin, and the Tanaim disagree with one another in the Mishnah. This is in fact the next Mishnah that we're going to do. Mehechan kore adam et Megillah v'yotzed b'yedei chovato. The Mishnah is going to ask, from what point does someone have to read the Megillah in order to fulfill their obligation? There are different opinions, but Rabbi Meir omer kula. Rabbi Meir says you have to read the whole Megillah. Rabbi Yehuda omer mi ishihudi, and Rabbi Yehuda says you can start from the words ishihudi. But again, the Gemara says, well, the halacha is that you have to say the whole thing. And even for the one who says that you only have to start from ishihudi, which is a little later in the Megillah, not in Parak Aleph, the whole Megillah has to be written before you. In other words, the text that you're reading from has to be a complete Megillah. Even if you hold that you don't have to read the entire thing, the whole thing has to be written in front of you. So didn't Rav say that that's the case? So this is a challenge to the idea that you could be thinking of the pasuk and then writing it down. So the Gemara responds, Ela demancha Megillah kame v'kari la mina psuka psuka ukatav la. No, it must be the case that, again, it's still talking about the case in our Mishnah, it must be the case that, yes, the person's reading, and they're reading from a fully written Megillah, because mancha Megillah kame, a Megillah is resting before this scribe, V'kari lamina, and he's reading from it, psuka psuka, one pasuk at a time, v'katava, and then the person writes it down. So yes, don't worry about the statement of Rav's. The person is in fact reading from a fully written Megillah, and Rashi just explains, mancha Megillah kame uma'atik mimana. This person is copying from the Megillah. So we've solved that problem. Lema Messiah Rabba Bar Bar Chana. Let's say that this helps, or that this supports the statement of Rabba Bar Bar Chana. And Rashi points out to you, Lema Masayale, Matnitzi Dikatani Yatza, that when our Mishnah says that if you Kotvad or Shamigiha, if you do any of these things, you're Yotze. And we've already established Lekala Ukma Elabama Atik Min Haktav. And we've already established that the Mishnah must be talking about a case where you're copying pasuk by pasuk from a written one. So this supports an idea that was put forth elsewhere by Rabba Bar Bar Chana, and here's the idea. It's Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Asur lichtov ot echat shelo min haktav. It's forbidden to write a single letter that's not from a written source, meaning in order to write a kosher book of the Torah, you have to be copying from another text. Dilma de itramile atrimuye. The Gemara says no, it doesn't necessarily support. This is a rejection. It doesn't necessarily support that idea, because maybe itramile atrimuye, a complete Megillah just happened to be before him when he was writing. So in other words, yes, it's true. Our Mishnah has to be about a case. Our Mishnah has to be about a case where the person is looking at a written Megillah, because otherwise they would be reading by heart. But not necessarily because our Mishnah supports the idea that you always have to write a Megillah from another written text. Maybe a Megillah just happened to be in front of the person, and that's how the person was able to be Yotzei their Chiyuv, by reading one pasuk at a time and writing it down. But not that our Mishnah is actually trying to teach us that you have to always copy a Megillah from another text. So we learn a halacha about reading, but not necessarily a halacha about writing. Gufa. Gufa literally means the thing itself. In this case, the Gemara is going back to a statement that was made above to analyze it a little bit further. The statement we just read, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Asur lichtov ot echat shelo min haktav. This idea that it's forbidden to write a single letter of the Torah if you're not copying it from another written Torah. Meitzveh, we have a contradiction to this idea. Amar Rashba, Ma'aseh Rabbi Meir, Ma'aseh Rabbi Meir shahalach la'aber shana be'asya, v'lo haya sham Megillah. It's a story that is told by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and it's about Rabbi Meir, who went to Asya in order to add a month to the year, right? He was going to change the length of the year. We talked about Ibor Shana earlier on. So he goes to this place called Asya to do that, and there was no Megillah. V'katva milibo v'kara. And Rabbi Meir wrote it down from his heart, meaning he knew the Megillah by heart, and he wrote it down, and he read it. Amar Rabbi Abahu. So the problem with that, right, is that seems to indicate that you could write a Megillah without a written text in front of you, whereas Rabba Bar Bar Chana said you can only write from a written text. So who's right? Amar Rabbi Abahu, Shani Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is different. It's just a whole different situation. The Mekayim Bey, because we fulfill through him the verse, or he is a fulfillment of this verse. V'apapayich yishiru negdecha. A pasuk from Mishlei. Your eyes, or the pupils of your eyes, will look straight in front of you. Amar le Rami Bar Chama le Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti. Now we're going to explain this verse. Mai va'apapayach ashiru negdecha. What is that? What does this verse mean? Again, this verse from Mishlai. Amar lo, elu divrei Torah. This is a reference to the words of Torah. Tichtiv bahu, about which it says, hitif einecha bo ve'einenu. Sorry, this is also a pasuk from Mishlai. And this one is if you blink or if you close your eyes away from it, then it's gone. So generally speaking, if you don't look at it, it's gone, right? If you close your eyes even for a second, you forget your learning. That's basically what Rashi says. Blink and it's gone. But this pasuk, V'apapayach yashiru negdecha, describes the fact that Reb Meir wasn't like that. His eyes were always looking straight in front of him, so he had basically total recall of all his Torah. So even though hitif einecha bo ve'einenu, even though if you blink it's gone, even so it was all totally straight, totally set for Reb Meir. And therefore he was an exception to the rule that you can't write the Megillah without looking at a written text, meaning that rule could stand and Reb Meir could just be an exception. Rav Chisda ashkechel Rav Chananel to have a katav sfarim shelo min haktav. Rav Chisda found Rav Chananel writing Sifrei Torah not from a written text. He wasn't copying, he was writing it by heart. Amar lei, ru'uya kol haTorah kula likatev al picha, ela kach amru chachamim, asur lichtov ot echad shelo min haktav. So he said to him, the whole Torah is worthy of being written from your mouth, meaning, yeah, you're good at this, you really could do this, but we have this thing that the Chachamim said, that it's forbidden to write even a single letter, not from a written source. Mitzika amar kol haTorah kula ru'ya shetikatev al picha, michlal demi yusharin henitzlo. From the fact that he said to Rav Chananel, the whole Torah is worthy to be written by your mouth, it must be that, it seems that, Miyusharin Hanetzlo, he too, the Torah was straight in front of him, meaning he also had total recall. So why would we make an exception for Reb Meir and not for him? The Reb Meir Katav, right? And didn't Reb Meir write it? So which is it? Can you have an exception or can you not have an exception for people who have perfect photographic memories? And the Gemara answers, Sha'at hatzchak shani. A case where you have extreme need is different, meaning it's not just that Reb Meir knew the whole Torah by heart, but he was in a place with no Megillah and he really had no other option. So there we can make an exception, but just knowing the Torah by heart is not enough to be able to make an exception. Going on with this theme, Abaye shara l'debei bar chebo l'michtav tefillin u'mezuzot shelo min haktav. Abaye gave permission to the house of Rabbi Chibo to write tefillin and mezuzot, not from a written source, from memory. And Rashi tells us that this household, Bebar Chabo, mocher tefillin hava. This person was a seller of tefillin, so it was particularly relevant. This is what they did. They wrote tefillin. And Abaye said you could do it from memory. Kiman, like whom, meaning whose opinion is reflected in this idea that you can write tefillin and mezuzot from memory. Ki hai tana de Tanya, like the Tana who taught this Breita, Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer, Mishum Rabbeinu, Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Tefillin u'mezuzot nichtavot shelo min haktav, ve'ein tzrichot shirtut. Tefillin and mezuzot can be written not from a written source, meaning you can write them just knowing them by heart. And also, ein tzrichin sirtut. They don't need etching or engraving. You don't need to, the lines that you need to make on a Torah scroll, when you're writing a Torah, you have to make, kind of like lined paper. You have to etch in lines to write on. So you don't need to do that for tefillin and mezuzot, according to this opinion. V'hilchata tefillin ein tzrichin sirtut, mezuzot tzrichin sirtut. Idi v'idi, nichtavot shelo min haktav. the halacha is that tefillin don't need this kind of engraving of lines. Mezuzot do. Edi v'edi, these and these, meaning in both cases, you can write them not from a written source. You can write them just by knowing the text by heart. And Rashi here says this word hilchata, which of course means the halacha, kach halacha Moshe miSinai. That's how we know the halacha. It's halacha Moshe miSinai. It's tradition. My taima, what's the reason? Meaning, why are you allowed to write tefillin and mezuzot, by heart, not from a written source? Migras grisin. Migras grisin. We're all very fluent in it. We all read it a lot. Rashi says, "Shkurot b'fi hakol." It's familiar in everyone's mouths, right? These are small pieces of text that, quote unquote, everyone knows, and that's why you're allowed to write it by heart. Okay, moving on in the Mishnah. Haytak tuva b'sam chulei. This is about the materials in which Megillah can be written. So if it was written with sam, that was one of the examples. So now the Gemara is going to translate these words. Sam, sama. So that's as close as we're going to get to a translation. The Gemara says sam is sama, which is translated in English as orpiment. Here is a picture of orpiment. It's a mineral, and presumably it can be used to make a dye, which is that color, and you can't write the Megillah in it. Sikra, Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Sikrata, Shma. So Rabba Bar Chana explains that this word Sikra is Sikrata for them, which is a bright red dye. Vermilion is how Rashi translates it. It's a very, very deep red. So also another colored dye. Kumus, kuma. So kumus is kuma, which Rashi tells us is a sap from a tree. Also, presumably that would have a color. But you can't use that either to write Megillah. Moving on in the materials that can't be used. Kankansum charata de ushkafi. And kankansum is also a type of colored material. It is the black stuff that a shoemaker uses to make the shoes black. So all of these materials you can't use as the ink for writing the Megillah. Diphthera, which is an unfinished kind of parchment. Demaliach v'kamiach v'lo afitz. It was salted, right? Because parchment is made out of animal hide, so there's all different ways you have to treat it. Rashi speaks about this a little bit. So it was salted, and kamiach is like washed in water. Washed in flour and water, because kemach is flour. So this is its processing. It gets salted and then floured and watered, below afitz, but it was not treated with gallnuts. Again, part of the processing that would allow it to become fully parchment. So diphthera is like not quite parchment yet. And niyar is machka, which is papyrus. So all those materials you can't use. Ad shetehek tuva ashurit. This is the end of the Mishnah until it is written in Ashuri, meaning it has to be written in Ashuri. Tichtiv kichtavam v'chizmanam. As it says in the Megillah, kichtavam v'chizmanam. We've talked about this before. It says that the Megillah is like their languages and like their times. So the Gemara learns from here, kichtavam, it has to be in their language, which is interpreted as being Hebrew, the original language, as it were. Al hasefer uvidyo v'chulei, and it has to be on parchment and in ink, black ink. Minalan, how do we know this? Acha ktiva ktiva, we derive ktiva and ktiva. We've seen this formulation before. We have two cases where that word is used. Ktiv hacha, it says here in Esther, v'tichtov Esther hamalka, that Esther wrote, meaning this is when she's presumably writing the Megillah, or the letter to the Jews. Uktiv hatam, and it says there in Yirmiyahu, v'yomer lahem baruch mipiv, yikra elai et kol hadvarim ha'ela v'ani kotev al hasefer b'dyo. So this is Baruch ben Neriah speaking. He's Yirmiyahu's scribe. Oops, that's part of the pasuk also. He's Yirmiyahu's scribe, and so he says to them, he talks to me, he calls to me from his mouth, and I write down everything that he says, and I write on parchment with ink. And since this is the way Baruch ben Neriah describes writing, we apply that here as well. Again, the connection is Vatichtov Esther and Ani Kotev al HaSefer B'Dio. True writing is on parchment with ink. And that brings us to the end of the Gemara on this Mishnah. We'll stop here.